5 individuals were shot: a congressman, a United States Capitol Police officer, a congressional staffer, a lobbyist, and the subject. An additional 2 individuals, a congressman and a Capitol Police officer, attained secondary injuries at the scene and were transported to local hospitals and treated.
Many of you know, many of you have heard that a few miles outside of Denver, in a town called Aurora, at least 12 people were killed when a gunman opened fire in a movie theater. And dozens more are being treated for injuries at a local hospital. Some of the victims are being treated at a children's hospital.
I'm here today to reflect on the tragedy that occurred in Colorado Springs last week. There, a gunman attacked a Planned Parenthood clinic, killing 3 people and injuring 9 others.
Because yesterday, a former student at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in northern Broward County, Parkland, Florida, walked on to the campus with a gas mask, smoke grenades, and carrying an AR-15 assault rifle. He pulled the fire alarm. He waited for the students to come out into the hallway, and he opened fire. And as a result, 14 families are grieving.
Hello. As you can see from the video, violence motivated by extreme thinking is not a new phenomenon. My name is Dr. Heather Morris, and I'm a major in the U.S. Air Force and an investigative psychologist with the Office of Special Investigations, or OSI. I'm assigned to the Behavioral Science Directorate at Headquarters OSI in Quantico, Virginia. In the Behavioral Science Directorate, we have a number of experts who have specialized training, education, and experience in applying psychological principles to investigations. We deal with topics like criminal behavior and the psychology of violence, just to name a few. My special role for OSI is to conduct behavioral threat assessments and consult on cases where there's a high concern for targeted violence. Targeted violence is a premeditated, predatory type of violence where the individual selects a target ahead of a violent attack. Violence that is motivated by extremist ideology, ideology meaning a belief system, is a type of targeted violence. Now, this is not something new that OSI just started to focus on recently. In fact, OSI has been focusing on targeted violence for the last several years, and I actually got my start back in 1999. I was studying forensic psychology when Columbine happened, and I became determined to figure out what motivates someone to engage in such a horrific act like mass murder and how it can be prevented. So I've been studying this topic and consulting on threat cases for over 20 years. My day-to-day duties focus predominantly on helping OSI protect the Department of Air Force from targeted violent threats, including those that are motivated by extremist ideologies. That is why senior leaders asked me to talk with you all today about this very important topic, extremism. While commanders across the Department of Air Force focus on ensuring environments that are free from impersonal behaviors, OSI focuses primarily on the criminal and violent end of the extremist continuum. Our goal in this section is to help you understand what extremism is so that you, no matter if you're an E1 or an 06 or a civilian employee or contractor, can intervene before it turns into a criminal act or violent behavior. We will be pausing throughout this section so that you can break up into small groups and apply the information we cover to various scenarios and vignettes. We'll start off by defining extremism from a behavioral science point of view and talk about the psychological factors that motivate extremism. Then we will discuss what extremism looks like by covering topics like physical signs and symbols of extremism and behaviors that research has identified as being risk factors for extremism. We will talk about how someone goes from a simple, normal belief or opinion and progresses all the way into extremism, and then how an individual progresses from extremism to violence. Finally, I will bring in one of my favorite OSI agents to explain more about how you can help the force in the fight against one of the most dangerous threats to our nation, domestic violent extremists. No one is immune from being lured into the world of extremism. We all can fall victim to the process of becoming extreme in our thinking or belief systems. So what does extremism actually mean? Later today, you'll talk about how the policy and the military law define things like advocacy, association, membership, and active participation in an extremist organization. And you'll discuss examples of impermissible behaviors. But how do you actually know what is extreme? What makes a particular belief or viewpoint extreme? What is the actual definition of extremism? Well, if you look it up in the dictionary or you Google it, you're likely not going to find a helpful answer. You're going to get something like, extremism is defined by the state of being extreme. How helpful is that? It's not very helpful at all. So you have to look deeper into the behavioral science research to get a more useful definition that can help you determine what makes a group or belief system extreme. The most helpful definition I found comes from a book called Extremism by J.M. Berger. It's a fantastic and easy read. He defines extremism as the belief that an in-group success or survival can never be separated from the need for hostile or violent action against an identified outgroup. So let's break that definition down a little bit further. An in-group is defined by specific qualities, values, characteristics that make up the shared identity. And it can be racial, religious, political, social, you name it. And the outgroup is broadly defined as not meeting those defined features of the in-group. Often the in-group will define and target a specific outgroup who they see in a negative light. This sets up the us versus them mentality. Now, in terms of success and survival for the in-group, this is typically described by a belief in hierarchy where they sit on top and feelings of entitlement and supremacy, along with the belief that their identity or their viewpoint is the one true thing. Whether it's a religion, race, political view, whatever, they believe it is the absolute truth and everybody else is just wrong. Now, hostility can include things like verbal attacks, discriminatory behaviors, and are seen in behaviors like name-calling, derogatory and hateful language, and even verbal threats. Discriminatory behaviors are acts where an individual treats others unfairly based on being a part of the targeted outgroup. Now, violence, it needs no further defining. We are all part of the DoD, and we know what violence is. But don't forget, we're also talking not just about actual violence against people or groups, but also property and animals and threats of violence. Think about those symbols of violence left for people to find to intimidate them, such as a bullet or a noose. Or, for example, think about those attacks on buildings or churches that happened when no one was around. Even with these, there are often unintended deaths or injuries. But also, think about what's next on the continuum. Actual violence against people. There are two main categories of extremism we in the DoD need to be aware of. One is homegrown violent extremism. The other is domestic violent extremism. Homegrown violent extremists live in the U.S. or its territories, and they advocate for, or they're inspired by, a foreign terrorist organization. Domestic violent extremists, on the other hand, also live in the U.S. and its territories, but they operate without direction or inspiration from foreign terrorist organizations. Examples of the most common types of domestic violent extremists include racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, such as a white supremacist extremist. Also, militia violent extremists. Those are individuals who are anti-government and seek to commit violence in response to perceived tyrannical parts of the U.S. government. There are also anti-authority extremists and domestic violent extremists motivated by single issues, like a specific conspiracy theory, or maybe other extreme ideology. Remember, to be considered extreme, the individual or group feels that hostile and violent action is justified against the targeted outgroup. For decades, the military has focused on the threat from foreign terrorist organizations and homegrown violent extremists. But intelligence agencies, law enforcement, at every level, and the academic research all agree that the bigger threat, the most lethal threat, comes from within our own borders, not from a foreign terrorist organization. It's domestic violent extremism engaging in targeted violence. That's not to say that we should just stop focusing on homegrown violent extremists and foreign terrorist organizations. We certainly need to continue that fight. But the major threat is actually from domestic violent extremists. We are not the only country dealing with domestic violent extremists. It's an issue many of our allies are also struggling with within their own borders. So this applies to you even if you're stationed overseas. Now that we know what extremism is and the type of extremism that is the biggest threat, let's discuss motivation. There are basic factors that motivate human behavior. For example, we all have the innate drive for survival. This comes from way back when our ancestors had to figure out how to survive daily. Even though we don't have to do that, we still have this innate drive to survive. Another motivation is, as humans, we do not like uncertainty. It causes anxiety and distress. And so we have a need or a desire to control those things that are causing the anxiety and distress. Another factor that motivates our behavior is our strong need to belong and to feel special. Now, these are just a few of the factors that motivate all of our behavior. And trust me, there are a ton more, but we don't have time to discuss them all. So these are just some of the ones that also tend to motivate extremists. So how do these basic human factors play out in the minds of an extremist? Well, extremists tend to feel that the mere existence of a targeted outgroup or the perceived actions of the outgroup are causing the in-group's demise. Therefore, they feel the need to engage in hostile or violent action in order for the survival of the in-group. Now, extremists respond to uncertainty the same way we all do. They feel anxious and distressed. And extremists also have a desire to control whatever it is that's causing that anxiety. But instead of taking a deeper look into what is realistically causing the distress and anxiety in their lives, which often involves multiple complex factors and self-reflection, they take another approach and blame the targeted outgroup for all of their problems. Then they feel justified to use hostile and violent actions or the threat of violence to intimidate and attempt to defeat the outgroup. That is how extremists think they control the factors causing their distress. Now, like all of us, extremists have a desire and need to belong, so they tend to gravitate towards others that share similar beliefs. Finding others who share their beliefs has become dramatically easier in the age of the internet. So now let's apply what we just discussed to a case. This is not a real case, but this is a similar behavior we have seen over the last couple of years within the Department of the Air Force. So let's pause for a short break to allow you time to hear a scenario and apply what you just learned. As you hear this case, identify the elements that define extremism and the motivations for extremist behavior. If that senior NCO had not come forward to report the airmen's social media postings, OSI and command would not have intervened, and the airmen may have escalated, possibly even committed a targeted violent attack. Even if you observe something and you're not sure if you should report it, think about this case. Now remember, the thing that really makes a belief system extreme is the thought that the in-group has to engage in hostile or violent actions toward the identified out-group in order to survive.